Hello everyone, my name is Gabriella Alberti. I'm Associate Professor in Work and Employment Relations at the University of Leeds Business School, and I'm also a member of the Centre for Employment Relations, Innovation and Change. My specialism is on labour migration, industry relations, and I'm particularly interested in understanding how different market and industry relations actors engage with the impact of migration on the labour market and on society and community more broadly.
Hi, my name's Jo Cutter. I'm a lecturer in Work and Employment Relations. I'm a colleague of Gabriella's in Work and Employment Relations department within Leeds University Business School. Also interested in industrial relations, although I have a specific focus on training, employment and skills. And we're part of a wider team of the project entitled Labour Mobility and Transition, a multi-actor study of the re-regulation of migrant work in low-skilled sectors. And interestingly, low-skilled is in inverted commas, and we might talk about that a little bit later as we go through this discussion of co-production. But by way of just getting into the podcast, Gabriella, maybe if you want to give an overview of the project as a whole.
Yes, of course. So our ESRC-funded project, which is going to last 3 years, actually focus on understanding the responses to the effects of Brexit and COVID-19 on so-called low-skill sectors of the economy. In particular, we have selected sectors like hospitality, social care, food manufacturing and warehousing, which have been historically reliant on the provision of migrant labour, which has of course been massively impacted by the end of free movement of labour because of Brexit at the beginning of 2021. And interestingly, the same jobs involved in these sectors have also been very much in the news during the COVID pandemic, considered to be jobs of high social value or essential, including during the lockdown, in particular social care, warehousing, logistics. So we really want to understand how actors on the ground are responding to these unique regulatory changes that have been brought by the end of free movement of labour, but also the socioeconomic impact of the pandemic. So this is really the essence of it, and our project is going to involve both quantitative and qualitative research across 3 different work packages. But really the involvement of key stakeholders from the very beginning of the project, the design of this research proposal, was absolutely central, considering the nature of the topic, but also our specific approach to working with participants in social science research. So perhaps Jo can give us a bit of an overview of our co-production approach and how we used it in developing the Labour Mobility and Transition project.
Yeah, you mentioned the sort of various actors involved within labour mobility, labour markets and support for migrants. So we would see that, in a sense, these actors, whether that's both national and local government, both policymakers and practitioners, trade unions, migrant rights organisations or organisations that are supporting migrants both to settle and to access work and employment, as being central to the discussion around this sort of changing scene that Gabriella has described. So in terms of thinking about co-production, I would say that our approach embeds some kind of core principles, particularly in terms of our governance framework, of how we have brought people from those different types of organisations into the advisory board, our external partner advisory board. And so the approach, particularly for this project, we felt that it was important to bring actors, as I say, we've been very much focused on how our governance framework we have an academic advisory board, but our external partner advisory board has this sort of structured iterative approach. So we have a plan, we have a work plan. Obviously, to have a successful bid, you have to have a structured plan that outlines what you plan to do in kind of key work packages, but that we very much value participatory engagement by those stakeholders. So it's not just an advisory board in this kind of classic sense of people come to meetings, have an opinion about your work and go away again, but that we've engaged them with the expectation that they would participate in a way that made sense for them. We also have reflective learning built into the sort of the activities of the programme. And we are also looking to build our own sort of research translation capabilities by working both with our partners and with other kind of intermediaries.
So how did we manage different perspectives and the different expectations in collaborating with our external partners? This is, of course, a very important area. I think ongoing reflexivity is paramount, is absolutely critical when you do any kind of co-production research. And I think that being very clear from the start about the aims of the project, making sure that your participants are really on board in terms of what the project aims to achieve, but also sharing the principles of co-production in itself, translating the principle of co-production in a less academic language in a way to make sure that everyone is on board, and also pragmatically to understand what is required from our stakeholders in terms of time, in terms of resources. After all, this is a kind of working collaboration, so it's very important that principle of mutual respect, flexibility are endorsed. I would say that like a key learning from our co-production practice has been the need to develop relationships earlier on to establish that sense of trust, and also the kind of importance of mutual understanding and the importance of listening to each other, taking into account that, as industry relations scholars, we know very well that we're dealing with incredibly different perspectives and assumptions about some of the issues we're dealing with. So making everyone aware of the fact that when we are together in a room and we're exchanging views, there might be conflicts and differences in points of view, but that the aim of the co-production approach is precisely to facilitate dialogue and to make sure that we create a safe space where practitioners feel at ease and can actually speak up their mind, but also listen carefully and actively to what others have to say. So the role of researchers in this sense is to really facilitate dialogue, which is, by the way, also the topic of our research, because facilitating a constructive dialogue on labor migration, which has been particularly divisive as a topic in the context of Brexit, is like one of the kind of core outcome that we aim to achieve.
Absolutely, no, I really agree with that. That I think just having that honest and fairly direct conversation with our partners, that sometimes there will be kind of challenging questions. So, for example, when we've had I remember in the first advisory group meeting, it was actually on the day of a budget announcement. So clearly there were kind of questions were around in the kind of the public discourse around who pays for certain kind of policy, whether it's kind of taxation, more taxation for workers, or whether it's kind of corporation tax for businesses. I mean, these are very real and ongoing policy discourses that our partners are engaged in outside of this project. And so it's important when we kind of bring people into the room to manage the discussion on this specific topic, how do we encourage people to bring their expertise, but put aside in a way that suspend for a moment their primary objective, often particularly those that are engaged in kind of policy dialogues day in, day out. Sometimes it's difficult for them to put aside their kind of habitus, if you like, from their daily work. But nevertheless, we do get feedback, and when we ask for reflection from our participants and our partners on this process, they really value it, because actually there are very few spaces that they themselves get an opportunity to engage in these sort of slightly different ways of thinking about the challenges that their constituents are facing every day, and how we might develop a slightly different way of engaging in dialogue to try and address these challenges at different levels. And that is, in a sense, sort of part of our experience of both reflecting on some of the earlier initiatives and this current one, even though we're in a relatively early stages, sort of 6 months into a 3-year project, that we're kind of reflecting on the fact that, we need to have slightly different. We need to be aware of language and how some language is received. So I mentioned right at the beginning this phrase low skilled sectors. Now this made sense to us in our initial analysis because Brexit, the new immigration rules after Brexit, focus on a points-based system fundamentally structured around skills levels. And so people in lower skilled categories do not have the same eligibility to access a visa as people in higher skilled occupations. And yet, having a sectoral focus on those sectors in which those workers, EU workers, have historically been based, those sectors really don't like the language attributed to them that they are a low-skilled sector. And so attention to this kind of language, but also having a space where people can say, I don't like the way you use those words, we would like you to rethink them, is not only one of kind of politeness and acceptability, but as researchers, it reminds us that the notion of skill can be seen to be a degree of being socially constructed, and that as researchers is a very important reflection as to how we think about this kind of category of worker. So yeah, thinking and listening to the language that's used by our different partners is also really a really important aspect of undertaking their kind of co-production work in this way. Another kind of experience that that's become more apparent is the need to be flexible and the need to be responsive. So again, there's this kind of an issue of timing, isn't there? Because we have a 3-year project, and the value of that is to be able to take a longer term look at these really important changes that are happening in the labour market and how they affect workers and employers on the ground. And yet our partners are looking to respond quickly. Clearly, they're trying to develop initiatives, ideas and activities for their constituencies, whether that's employers, trade union reps, migrant advisory teams. They're looking for resources right now that can help them in terms of addressing the challenges that they're facing on the ground. So we're trying now clearly we need to stick to our 3-year plan, but there are things that we can do in the shorter term. For example, kind of some of the seminars and webinars, I think will probably pull forward some of the initial work on the ground in terms of thinking of mapping the initiatives that are currently taking place. We were going to do much later in the programme, but we can start doing that now on the basis of some of the evidence that we've started to collect. So that flexibility is all important, and thinking about the ways in which we can tailor our activities for different kind of constituents. So I think originally we'd thought that sort of everybody would be involved in everything, but A, that's not realistic, and B, there's that flexibility to say, well, certain partners are more interested in certain aspects. So, for example, one of the areas that we're looking to develop in terms of outputs is specific resources for HR managers who may be kind of unfamiliar with or have less experience and understanding of supporting EU workers who are subject to new immigration rules. And clearly not all of our partners would be interested in getting involved in those kind of outputs and activities. So that kind of flexibility on the ground while sticking to this broad structure is part of the challenge, but also really interesting for us to learn as researchers as how to do this.
So if we had to kind of summarize the kind of key learning point or like recommendations for researchers who are willing to embrace the co-production approach, which in my personal view is like a kind of must for social scientists nowadays to really produce research that has an impact in dialogue with others who are directly impacted. I would say that first, you really need to engage early on with your desired stakeholders. Being very clear about what is required from your stakeholders, from your co-production partners, I think this is very, very important, and is also about ethics and clarify what is required from them in terms of times and resources earlier on. Keeping in mind that principle of mutual flexibility, but trying to accommodate as much as possible the time needs of our practitioners, partners. Being open in terms of, adjusting some of your initial plans. And I think this idea of keeping an open mind in terms of understanding the different points of view, especially if you deal with relatively contentious topics like migration for work, economic change, and social crisis like the one we are experiencing right now. So these are my key takeaway points from a reflection on our co-production practices. And I hope that this has been useful for junior researchers and for our colleagues everywhere, whoever is listening to this podcast.
Thanks, Gabriella.